Will cooperate.
All right,
Here we are. Good evening. This is Paranormal Science Lab Live. I'm Lisa.
I'm Kathy. I'm Jackie.
And we are very pleased to have a special guest this evening, Brian Stroud. Brian, how are you doing?
Doing good. How are you doing?
Oh, doing really good. Ryan is a longtime investigator and a specialist in spiritual warfare. And it's always a good show when we get together, so kind of interested on what we come up with. We were kind of banding around the topic of different approaches to spiritual warfare. And we were discussing a case earlier today that came out of Texas. That might be a jumping off spot of how you approach things. What do you think?
That case is kind of a special case, though. I mean, I would probably approach that one a little bit different than most. That's because of the situations dealing with the case and how dramatic they were. So.
Well, that's true. Well, how about we'll just do a little background and then we can use other hypotheses later. This was a case where a woman was found. She had been dead for weeks or months, and she had previously had a child who died and basically became isolated. And when they found her, there was basically an altar to the child and notes, including one written the day that she was found by the police, that kind of indicated that spirit was involved. And some investigators tend to think that it was a thought form that she had created.
So wait, she was dead for months, but there was a letter written on the day that she was found?
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Basically, I would really consider doing some research on whether or not it was a thought form, only because some of the things that were considered to be found at the altar itself, the fact that she had written a spell in Sanskrit, and the fact that she had a doll or a puppet of some kind makes me want to lean more towards something golem in nature rather than something thought form based. And the only reason why I say that is because, in the article it kind of mentioned that tulpas once created, they tend to break away from the person who created them once they have enough power to do so. And if these investigators were in this location and there was some spirit that was just wild and running amok, I would think they'd have more interaction versus something like a golem, which was being given life. And once that person is no longer there to give that life, it then vanishes at its own will. To me, that kind of situation would make more sense than having some sort of Bell Witch type scenario, even with the poltergeist activity, perhaps. But what's throwing me off is the same thing that's throwing you guys off. The letter that was written, or supposedly written, the day that she was found, even though she'd been dead for months prior. So that's what I would kind of lean into when they started to do my investigation.
Well, I guess another detail is that the police said that they got multiple 911 calls that day that were silent.
Right.
No one had seen her for about 6 months, and then they said from the state of the body she'd been dead for weeks to a couple months.
That's very interesting.
Right.
So,
and that's where part of my investigation technique comes into play, because how you do something that deals with 6 relationships, and those relationships are based off of the person, the claim, the environment, and the history of the location, and it's the relationship between those 4 things that give you 6 different types of relationship. And since the one that I would pay most attention to is person versus environment, because they said everywhere in this house was dirty and covered in dust, except for the room that she was in that was, pristine.
right.
So it's more apt to believe that there may have been someone in the house who found her, wrote this note because they knew what she was going through, called the cops multiple times, if there was some way to locate the presence of other people in the environment itself. If that wasn't there, then your guess is as good as mine without doing an investigation.
Exactly. And I agree with you, but I can see where people really jump to certain conclusions when they come across a unusual scenario, and that's really out there as far as scenarios. But I think that's one thing, is that people tend to jump to those conclusions faster than they should. Even the investigators that were brought in by the current owner, it sounds like.
Right, and that's why I mentioned earlier the six relationship technique, where you've got the person versus claim, and what I mean by that is this person and the claim that they're experiencing, does that mesh? Does that make sense? If they're saying that they've got some sort of entity that's keeping them up all night and they're tired and they're angry, but when you meet them, they look like they're fully rested. There's no signs of fatigue. They're not showing any signs of insomnia. That's one part of the relationship that tends to break down what you're trying to say is actually true. So you've got that, and you've got the person versus the history, which is if a person is seeing Native American ghosts in their house or Native American spirits in their house, but they're living in an area that's never had any Native American background, does that mesh well with what they're trying to tell you? And then person versus the environment, which we talked about moments ago, where you see this person in this house, but is there any signs of environmental factors that people are overlooking just because of fear, or the fact that they're dealing with something they haven't dealt with before?
And I agree with you. And to be honest, that's the kind of analysis that we always try to make in any kind of case, to be honest.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's the goal.
Right. Unfortunately, it does not seem that that's a universal practice by investigators.
Unfortunately, I mean, it seems to be an issue.
Back there. Sorry. Did you hear that, Keith?
We're having activity. We're in the Opera House in Carthage, Missouri, and we're having activity.
Yeah, it sounds like there's somebody in the back room over there, and there's nobody else up here.
Yeah. I was just back there, so I'm probably upset.
Sorry.
Sorry.
We just had a lot of commotion in the back room where there isn't anybody at, so.
We're blaming it on the owner upsetting the resident spirits. So
I had them repair the roof toward the end of summer, and I had a chance to come up here because I like to be up here by myself.
Why don't you like to be up here by yourself, Keith?
Because he likes following me around.
Yeah.
see, we need to get Ryan down here and check out the Opera House. That'd be great. I think you'd find it interesting.
No, I'd love to. I think it'd be a lot of fun.
Well, we'll get back on track. Actually, I guess probably the boot man's in the back. That's what we refer to one spirit because he always sounds like he's walking in boots. But and he loves to follow people around, especially Keith.
Familiar face, huh?
Yeah.
I guess so. Let's talk a little bit about different types of approaches if you're dealing with a pretty intense case.
Okay. From my point of view, finding out what you're dealing with is the very first step. And I mean, while that seems obvious, it's really not for most people, because most people who do a DIY eradication or removal, they tend to stir up things more than they solve them. And that tends to be because they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
I agree with that.
Yeah, exactly. What I mean by that is they're trying to take their own beliefs and, apply them to whatever they're dealing with. Like you go to an old German castle and you're trying to ask the spirit questions, trying to figure out why it's haunting it, but you're doing it in English and it has no idea what the hell you're talking about. So you have to really do your research about the spirit or the ghost that you're trying to reach if you want to do anything any good. So that's the first thing that I tend to deal with. The second thing is you have to know who you are and what your strengths and weaknesses are. If you are dealing with something that you have never dealt with before in a religion or a spiritual practice that you've never dealt with before, it's better to find someone who's reputable in the field, because if not, all you're doing is pretty much smacking this entity in the face where a lot of these escalations come from. So,
Oh, yeah, I agree with you there. That I think that happens a lot, and often then people end up going through sometimes multiple investigators until they get someone in there to deal with it.
right, research is key. It's not only a good foundation to have. It's also something that you, by doing so, you're constantly learning new things, and especially doing in a field that's so hard to pin down a lot of specifics. Doing as much as you can, as well as you can, will help you. And by doing so, it's easier to break an attachment or to remove something from a location or even a person if you have the right foundation and the right tools to do so.
Do you find that a lot of investigators? I mean, we think of ourselves as pretty open-minded to be in this field to begin with, but do you find that there's a closed-mindedness about approaches and that actually interferes with being successful beyond what we were talking about a minute ago?
Being closed-minded isn't so much a bad thing. It's kind of like being a skeptical in a world of believers. You need both sides of it. The problem is when people become so stubborn that they can't see other points of view and other, ways to help solve a problem. If you're truly all there to solve a problem, working together to try to get ideas that fit the best solution is always going to be better than people who are just so stuck in their ways that they have to do it this way. They have to do it this way every time, or it's the highway, because that's where you're going to lead into a lot of problems. In the field, innovation and adaptability is just as important as practicality and efficiency. So,
I wholeheartedly agree with that. What do you think? What do you think are the tools that are overlooked the most?
The tools that are overlooked the most?
Uh-huh.
I would say your brain is one of them. And the reason why I say that is because you see a lot of groups that are always using technology. They're always using technology. What's the newest thing that we can plug in and use? What's the best device that we can use to do this? Thing is, there's very, very few pieces of equipment that were actually used or created for paranormal research that people actually use. I mean, the Geiger counter was not used originally for paranormal research, and neither was the flare or even the audio recorder. These are all things that have been adapted to try to fit theories that people have. Right. So while they may provide some type of evidence, the most important tool that you can use is your mind. Because if you go into a place relying solely on equipment and it fails, what are you supposed to do? How do you collect your evidence? Also, excuse me, if you go into a place and you're freaked out, running around, everything you see can be taken as paranormal. That's where the idea between something that's not paranormal and paranormal comes into play with the xenonormal phenomenon. Xenonormal phenomenon is activity that appears paranormal that isn't. And if you can't tell the difference right off the bat, or at least try to find ways to do so, you're going to be misinterpreting a lot of evidence.
I agree with you.
So that's the.
Why don't you give an example of that of the paranormal?
Xenonormal phenomenon. Uh-huh. Okay, for example, let's say that pareidolia is very common. It's where, say, someone takes a picture and they look at it, and in the cloud or in the reflection, they see a face.
Right.
They may interpret it as a ghost when actually it's just your brain trying to recognize patterns. Another example would be, let's say, you're in your house and your TV starts flashing, and it goes off, comes back on, goes off, comes back on, and no other type of electricity issues are happening. Someone may interpret it as paranormal when it could just be a short in the wiring of your TV. Those are just examples of xenonormal phenomenon.
Well, I thought it'd be a good idea to throw out a couple of examples there for listeners so they understand exactly what we're talking about. And another thing I find is that I think predominantly, at least in the U.S., investigators approach things either from almost an atheist viewpoint or a Christian viewpoint or sort of a neo-pagan viewpoint. But I find that there really isn't a lot of learning or incorporation of tools and practices outside of those three.
Types of religions and spiritualities,
Yeah.
And see, that's key. You have to be. If the more you know, the more knowledge you have, the more adaptable you are in each situation. I mean, you have to, like I said, you have to know your limits. But if you know stuff about shamanism, if you know stuff about Druidism, if you know enough about Islamic religions, and Hindu, and all those other things, if you have a background, it's something that you know enough about, when you deal with cases, you're at least familiar enough to, if you cannot solve the case yourself, reach out to those who can. So, like I said, research is key, whether it's through technology, whether it's through psychology, whether it's through basic investigation or spirituality. The more you know, it's always a good thing.
I find that I think people assume, say, we're all here for, live or from the Midwest, and we tend to just not even think outside that box. Most people don't. To even think that, Kabbalistic or Far Eastern traditions might be involved in a case, because we tend to look at, this place was built in the 50s and very, WASP owners, that kind of thing, and so though those kind of entities are not relevant, but do you find that sometimes you have spirit that is involved that doesn't seem to be connected to the environment or the people involved as far as traditions?
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be, they could have an object in their house that something is attached to that they thought was pretty at a thrift store that turns out to be an Asian-influenced, magical, put a lot of faith into and a lot of power into, so therefore the ghost is attached to that physical object. Therefore, it wouldn't be related to anybody who lives in the house, it wouldn't be related to the past owners or the history of the location. It's just the object that someone thought was pretty at the local thrift store. So, just because the history may not match exactly doesn't mean that you're only set on the people who you know that live there, or the people who lived there prior. You have to widen your perspective if you want to see everything.
I agree. How often do you, in your opinion, do you find that claims are not paranormal versus paranormal?
So, that's a tough one to answer, only because it seems that with the popularity of the paranormal and the recent spike in popularity anyway, and the fact that the popularity in Wicca and, like you said, the neo-paganism, that people are always wanting something like that to happen, so they tend to see things where there's not actually anything going on. I do a lot of cases a month, so percentage-wise, I'd probably say 70-30, where 70 are either people making something up to get attention, or they're misunderstanding the things that they're perceiving. It's not necessarily that means to be that they're trying to be lying about certain topics. It's they have a limited knowledge and they don't know exactly how to apply the things that they're seeing. So, for me personally, it's probably a 70-30 base, and I think that would depend on which group you're talking to at the time.
I think you hit the nail on the head too when you said sometimes people want something to happen. They want that either a loved one or a family member, something like that passed. They really want that kind of thing to be going on, and really they see things happening. They imagine that it's something more than it is. It's my grandfather or my grandmother or whatever making that happen, and sometimes it's
that. And some people are just full of shit, and they want to just they just want something to happen because they want to be famous and on TV.
Well, that's true, or they're wanting the spook house or roller coaster ride experience, basically.
Well, people do like to have that notoriety, like a bar that's haunted or a restaurant that's haunted, a hotel, so people will come there for that thing to happen, try to experience that.
I don't know. I
And see,
find that.
and that's another issue because with the evolution of the prankster, of the person who's doing these hoaxes, and people who are doing all claims that are just ludicrous claims. With the evolution of their technology, since we are in a technological world, we as investigators have to evolve as well. So by doing that, we have to recognize what's fake. We have to recognize what's real. We have to recognize what could be real. And by doing that, you have to do your research, because if you don't, you're just going to get lumped into these groups who just take face value for everything and want the paranormal field to evolve at all. That's not how it's going to work.
It's true. Even within our group, sometimes we'll catch evidence, or somebody will present something to us as, does this look like it's paranormal? And even among our group members, a lot of times we'll disagree. Some will say it looks fake. Some will say it looks real. Some will say it looks like a natural event, and some think it's paranormal.
Right.
So, it's hard, like you said, because technology is advancing so quickly. It's advancing as quickly as our equipment is advancing. And so we can't really keep up with the fakery sometimes. And it's really good.
Well, that reverts back to the fact you've got to use your head.
Yeah.
Early investigators, they use, how their writing implements in their brain, and they try to recreate things as best as they knew how. 100 years ago, you didn't have the equipment that they have these today.
Right.
And while, they use different types of investigation techniques, it doesn't mean that they were less intelligent or more intelligent, or that they were wrong about anything. It's just that you have to use the tools that you're given, but you can't rely on them so much that that's the only way you know how to investigate.
It's almost like, in 100 years ago, because of fakery, people started to distrust investigators who relied on their senses. And so when you had the resurgence in popularity in the paranormal in the last 20 years, everyone wanted to avoid that, and so we want to rely on equipment. And now we're kind of flipping back and forth.
Just got dubbed on.
Well, and that's true. I mean, when it comes to spirituality and science, people tend to separate them with a hard line.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that's not the case. They're different branches on the same tree. You have to understand that, early spirituality gave rise to a lot of modern science. For example, let's say the Vikings were dealing with a certain type of ailment, and they thought that it was related to a certain type of spirit, and they noticed that this certain type of herb, when made a certain type of way, for example, if I make a tincture out of this root and drink it, it prevents the headache demons, you know what I mean?
Right.
Over time, these people started writing these things down and realized that it's more science rather than spirituality. It doesn't mean that the people who believe that these herbs had power are wrong. It just means that they gave credit to something that was more unseen versus basic pharmacology. So, spiritual tools and spiritual warfare and spiritual investigations, they shouldn't be looked at as separate from scientific if done the correct way. They should be looked at as an additional path that the person on a scientific team can approach and use and try to round out for a better investigation.
I agree. I definitely agree.
On the topic of spiritual warfare, being that we're paranormal investigators, what is your take on when you leave an investigation? Sometimes we do private investigations, and sometimes when you leave an investigation, you leave with a sense of sorrow, grief, sadness, whatever, depression, because when you finally make contact with the spirit, what do you think, first of all, is the root of that, and what do you think people can, as investigators, we should do to sort of help that from happening?
Well, the way I look at this is everyone has more potential to use parts of their brain that we haven't developed yet completely. So imagine that everyone is in the middle of a forest, and they each have their own personal handheld radio. Some people who are more sensitive or psychic mediums, whatever you want to call them, let's say they have a better antenna, which allows them to have more reception. Okay? So go sensitively or more susceptible to these types of feelings or these types of emotions. Therefore, when they leave, they've got that residual sadness, grief, joy, rambunctiousness, whatever they're feeling. It could be because they're more sensitive. It also could mean they had one too many amps while investigating, and now they're leaving, they're coming down from it. So, first of all, you have to take note of how you're feeling prior to the investigation, during, after. Make a pattern, make a note, see if that's something that is recurring on more than one case, or if it's the same case, if you're getting the same feeling each time. Those are things you have to take notice in order to do it. So now let's say that you've set up a pattern and you realize that you are sensitive or you are experiencing these things, and it is anything that's going to provide you with a modicum of faith is something that you should use. If you're Christian, do something that's going to involve power for you. Because what you're not trying to do is affect the spirit, or the ghost per se, so you don't need to adapt to them. You need to do something that allows you to feel like you are protected, or you are away from the hands of harm per se. So in my professional opinion is make note, make sure that what you're feeling is due to the investigation, and allow yourself to have some sort of talisman or some sort of prayer ritual that you do prior to going and afterwards to prevent any sort of attachment or negative feelings from affecting you.
You hear that, Jackie? I'm talking to my daughter. My daughter's here with us, and at this particular location that we're at, she always ends up leaving here feeling really uncomfortable, and sometimes she just can't even control it, and she has to just leave, and she gets tearful, and
like she's like a being watched, kind of like a sadness type of feeling.
The one time that I did have to actually leave, it wasn't like a scared. I just I just started crying, and I was just like really, really sad, and I had to go outside. And the farther I got away from this place, the better I felt.
Mm-hmm. How old are you?
17.
That's a big part of it.
Have you? I'm sorry.
I said that's a big part of it. I think.
Yeah, it could
be.
It could be the whole hormone thing. It could mean that you are more open to certain things. It could mean you could have just been repressing feelings that you were having a long time ago, and now that you were in a situation that was new to you. And you weren't thinking about all those issues that came flooding back, and you could be relating out to the location rather than to what you should be dealing with on a personal level. If it's just this location and you haven't had any of those other experiences before, I would try going to other locations to see how you feel when you leave, to see if you have a similar type of reaction.
she's nodding her head. You can't see that.
Yeah, she's still.
No, I mean, cause the way I look at it is, don't try to create a problem to solve. Make sure that you have enough information to solve a problem if there actually is one. And that seems to be a lot of problems, or a big issue with a lot of groups, is they go into a place expecting that there to be a problem for them to fix. And by doing so, subconsciously they're looking for things that could be an issue. You don't want to do that. You want to go in with an open mind and a clear mind, and then take note of things. And then if a pattern arises, that's when you fix the problem. So just make sure that if you go anywhere else, to take note of how you're feeling prior, during, and after, and keep record of that. That way you know that if there is an issue that you have to face, that you can do it correctly and not, after the fact.
Here's one. I think you kind of touched the subject, made me think of it. There are a lot of groups who just sort of rote and routine think that they are eradicating or banishing or helping human spirits move on. And what do you think of that practice? I've got my own thoughts.
Well, I mean, the biggest problem when it comes to that is vernacular. People are calling ghosts spirits and spirits ghosts and banishing houses, exercising places. Okay, so here's the thing. Ghosts and spirits are different. Ghost is the disembodied disembodied energy of something that was created on the material realm. Your material realm is anything that you perceive with your basic 5 material senses. You can see it, taste it, touch it, smell it, feel it. Those are the type of things you have to, and hear it. Those are the type of things that are from the material realm. If it was born here and it died here, it's a ghost. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Spirit refers to things that were created from a spiritual realm. So, angels, demons, fae, those are things that exist in a different realm that we perceive through the energetic realm. So if they have enough energy to appear here, we see them. If as people we have enough energy to see them via psychic or medium, whatever, that's what we're perceiving. They don't exist here naturally. That's what makes them a spirit. So possession and attachment are different. Attachment is something that ghosts do. Ghosts tend to attach to people, to places, to objects. They do not have the power to possess because they cannot physically push out a soul or an entity that's already in an object or a body. Okay, so that's where the attachment comes into play. Possession is something that spirits do because they have the energy to do so. Now, when it comes to banishing, you tend to banish things from locations, okay? Mm-hmm. Because by doing a banishment, you're removing something from a place. A exorcism is where you're releasing control that a spirit has on a person. There's a difference. You do not exorcise locations, you banish from locations. For an exorcism to take place, it has to have control of the original host without having the original host having any control of the body. Since a house or a location are they're not living, they're inanimate, they cannot be possessed, only attached to. A cleansing is something that you do with an object. You do not banish something from an object. You do not exorcise an object. Once again, because it needs exorcising needs, it can't be inanimate. And banishing from cleansing is banishing deals with the interaction of people who are residing or have frequented a location. Now, you can say, well, I banished this from this person's object. Well, what you're doing is you're actually cleansing from that object because the person doesn't necessarily reside there. It's just something that they have to offer or have to hold on to. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Now,
okay, so
go ahead.
The biggest problem when it comes to groups is they're saying, oh, well, we exorcised this guy's house. Well, no, you really didn't. You may have gotten rid of whatever was there, but that's called a banishment. If you're trying to exorcise a person's house and using exorcism rites, you're not doing anything. You're just speaking fancy words out of your Bible or out of your practice that you're trying to deal with. It's like trying to use a hammer to break eggs. You can do it essentially, but it's definitely the wrong tool for the job.
What do you make of there seems to be a surge in what I refer to as do-it-yourself exorcisms, banishments, etc. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, it's a horrible idea. You know what I mean? I've been practicing for over 15 years, and for the first 5 years, I didn't do a damn thing but read. I mean, it seemed like if I wasn't at school doing homework or, spending time with my family, I had my nose in a book. I was writing stuff down. For 5 years, I did nothing but study different religions and different religious practices. And I mean, I still do that to this day. So for 15 years, I've been practicing. But for that first 5 years, I never went into a house. I never went to a certain location until I could memorize and repeat with, 100% efficiency what I was doing. There's a lot of people that are like, you know what, I'm gonna go banish something from this house that I think is creepy, and I'm gonna look up on Google how to do it. That's a horrible idea. It's like saying, oh, I found this bomb. Let's see that if we can defuse it by watching a YouTube video. It may be possible. It may be possible, but it's likely it's going to blow up in your face.
That's a good analogy.
When it comes to eradications, and it comes to banishings, and it comes to removals, if you don't have many years of experience doing it, find someone who does, because technically client, you have a small chance of doing it correctly, you could just make things, and that's what you want to do to anybody, so just, either find someone that knows what they're doing or pass it off to someone who can do it correctly, because if you're there to help people originally, doing something that could get them hurt is not worth the risk.
And I think another thing to say is that I think everyone kind of assumes, these things work, and banishments work all the time, and a cleansing takes care of things, but that's not true. Would you agree?
Not necessarily. I mean, because when you say banishing, if you want me to banish something, my first question is going to be, what banishing? Where is the location at? Because, there's 1,010 different ways that you can get rid of something, but if you're not choosing the right one, you're not using the right tool for the job, it's not going to work. Hence, goes back to doing your research. And a lot of people, they just think, I'm going to do this, I'm going to read this Christian exorcism right, and, by the name of Jesus Christ, it's going to, if you're dealing with a Dybbuk, which is a Jewish demon, they're just going to be like, what the fuck are you trying to read to me? Leave me alone.
Be more irritated.
It's going to piss them off, and it's going to make things worse.
Right.
Well, we do get clients that call sometimes. We had one actually not that long ago who really thought that her family was being attacked, there was an evil spirit and it was attacking the people in her family because of a string of really bad things happening. And then on top of that, a shadow figure seen around the property. But it is difficult as investigators to get called into these situations where people think that they're dealing with, a curse, a demon, or something like that that's attacking their family. We kind of get in a situation where we have to very kind of gingerly explain and try to teach these people without discrediting what they're thinking is going on at the same time. It is.
Well, yeah, there's a fine line between explaining to someone that they may be misinterpreting something versus calling them batshit crazy. So basically, what you have to do is you have to say, yes, I understand. We'll do our research, and then present to them, this is what we found. This is what it could be. I would like to come back for another investigation to help verify what we found versus what you're claiming. Because a lot of these groups, they're like the one-night stand investigators, where they come in, they do it, and they're like, "Oh, cool, that was neat. We caught some cool shit. You're on your own." Yeah. And that's not what you need to do. You need to, do multiple investigations just to make sure that you're doing everything correctly. Because if you don't, once again, you're not doing your due diligence, and you're just going to get someone pissed off in the end. So I still have clients who I've solved cases for that I've become friends with, that I talk to on a regular basis, because I want to make sure that they're doing okay still. Mm-hmm. It's not those things where, I've helped you to the best of my ability. If anything else happens, screw you. That's not the kind of way that's not how you need to be. So when you're dealing with those people who, it's the worst case scenario, no matter what, you have to explain to them, this is what we found. I would like to come back to try to re-establish some type of connection with the claim that you're experiencing. That way, just because I didn't experience it on one night doesn't mean I want to experience it next Tuesday. Exactly. So by allowing me to come back, it allows me to help you more effectively. And, based on what you find, you may see shadow people on the property, but they may not realize that it's an optical illusion caused by passing traffic. You have no idea. That's so true. You have to establish a repertoire with the person, not just what the investigation you're trying to deal with.
I'm trying to decide how to word my question. A lot of people will misinterpret activity because they assume there's no such thing as curses or spells, hexes, etc. And we kind of delving more into hoodoo, voodoo, Santeria, and a few things.
Right.
And try to illustrate a little bit what goes on there that's misinterpreted as paranormal or that can create paranormal activity?
Maybe I'm having a problem with the question. Are you saying like what type of voodoo or hoodoo or Santeria type situations can lead to people thinking it's paranormal rather than spiritual?
Sure, that's a good jumping off point, I think.
Okay. There's if you're in an area where there's a lot of the voodoo or hoodoo or Santeria type, chances are people tend to know a little bit about it. Now, if you are dealing with, let's say, you cut somebody off and they got pissed off at you and they found out where you live and now they're laying hands on you spiritually. I mean, it just depends on the type of phenomenon that you're experiencing. Some people deal with shadow work, which means they see shadows on their property. But mostly, if you're dealing with curse-type phenomenon, it's going to be things more related to things affecting you directly. It's going to be nightmares. It's going to be
illness.
Things of yours misplacing, fatigue. It's going to be more focused on you rather than the location that you're in. So, let's say you live in a house with 4 people, and you're the only one experiencing the phenomenon, and you're not bashing. It could be that someone's put hands on you, or someone's laid a curse on you, versus the fact that you're the only one seeing things in the house. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Well, that type of phenomenon, it's more on a scenario or situation based type of thing, because it's hard to say because it depends on the type of curse or the type of hex or the type of hand or the type of funk that the practitioner placed on that person in general.
And don't you find that practitioners who are able to do that tend to have, how should I say, other sensitivities, other abilities?
Well, tends to do so, yeah. Every once in a while you may get the random person who goes out and's like, listen, this person's, really an asshole to me. How do I get rid of it? So they go to the local spiritual store and they talk to the person who works there and they explain them the situation and they give them this kit and, 1 out of 10 times it works, and now they don't know how to handle it. But other than that, if someone's laying hands on you, it tends to mean that they're a seasoned practitioner and they tend to know what they're doing. Now, a blind nut can find a squirrel, or a blind squirrel can find a nut every now and then, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case every time.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at. Now, sort of a flip side is that when we talk about spirit and other types of creatures, in today's day and age, we tend to discount things of what even people who believe in ghosts and demons and so forth. But the spirit realm really goes beyond just angels and demons.
Well, of course, and it's to me it's silly that if a person can believe in angels and demons, why can't they believe in other stuff too? It's easier for me to believe in the idea of aliens than to discredit them, because we live in a very small speck in the universe. How can I say that there's something else doesn't exist, just because it's outside of what I am comfortable believing? It's like people didn't think black swans existed until someone saw one.
Exactly. Well, and
so,
and also things that people were commonly believed in the past that aren't now.
In other countries too, where people still believe in fairies and elves and things like that.
Vampires, werewolves,
they don't
shapeshifters.
We consider, like in America, that we don't really put a lot of stock into those things until you experience something like that, and then you kind of become a believer. But,
well, and that could just be because we think we're so intelligent and technologically advanced that this other shit doesn't exist. But you have stories of Native American shapeshifters, of Wendigos, of skinwalkers that are prevalent in the United States, and there are still people today who are experiencing them in the mountains or even all over the world. It's just here we tend to be more, what can we see, what can we hold, what can we eat? And that's what tends to be more important to investigators in this area versus everywhere else in the world.
I'm a true believer in that. We've gotten so used to just seeing what's in front of our face, where people, our ancestors, they could see things that were out there. They looked at the distance, they looked afar, and they could see things that we have lost the ability to see because we just are so used to everything being obvious and right in front of our faces.
Yeah, and I'm not saying go out there and believe someone tells you they saw a werewolf and a vampire playing chess in the middle of a forest, you should believe it. But just because they tell you that doesn't mean that vampires and werewolves don't exist. It just means that it's plausible that they do. Do you have credible proof? Not necessarily. But it's easier for me to say they may exist versus absolutely not. They're only fairy tales, because that's not true. So
I think that,
like I said, it's easier to believe in the idea and give possible credit to than to deny everything besides what you believe, because that just makes you a moron.
I think the interesting thing is this this conversation about where do cryptids end and spirit entities start and so forth is actually coming up in the subject of Bigfoot.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, that's a really hard determination to make, because if something shapeshift, it's more likely to be more spiritual, in my opinion, like a person changing into a wolf, versus something that could be a byproduct of evolution. Cryptids, in my opinion, are creatures that tend to fit into the realm of the material realm. For example, Nessie being a dinosaur versus Bigfoot being, a missing evolutionary link, versus, the Native American Wendigo, which is an ice creature that tends to eat people. Is it more plausible to be scientific versus is it more plausible to be spiritual that helps to determine the line between spirits and cryptids?
Oh, I agree. But I find it interesting that in just the last probably 2 or 3 years, you get a lot more conversations about could Bigfoot be a shapeshifter or a time traveler or so on and so forth, almost as if...
Or an alien bodyguard or something.
Exactly.
It's a Wookiee.
Yeah.
But it's like we're exploring this subject that we can't bring ourselves to talk about outright, about shapeshifters or wendigos or werewolves, etc. But I think maybe because Bigfoot is something that we believe, okay, that could exist and be biological, and people are exploring those subjects relative to that instead of other things. But
and I think a lot of that has to do with people are more inclined to believe something science-based versus something spiritual-based. For them, it's easier to believe Bigfoot is just an evolutionary byproduct. And then when they can't prove it scientifically, that's when they start to go, oh shit, right. Maybe there is something more to this that's spiritual, versus, you're walking out in the middle of the woods and you see a guy turn into a wolf and run away, because to them that doesn't work for them scientifically, versus it's easier to go the scientific route and then start to wean your way back into the spiritual, versus going completely off the left-hand path and be, oh my God, this is a spirit that's shape-shifting in front of me, because in nature we don't see a whole lot of shape-shifting.
Right. And another thing that gets talked about a lot is almost a shamanistic tradition about walking the veil and so forth.
Right.
And I think people bandy that about and don't really understand what that really means. What do you think?
Right. I don't think so either necessarily. I mean, and like I said, this all relates back to vernacular, where one person walking the veil and stepping sideways is the same thing as a medium, a person who can see both worlds at the same time. so they tend to be more open to the spiritual as well as the material. Like I said, it all depends on how you want to describe your ability. Voodoo practitioners, they can relate it to being underwater, and what they mean by that is it's in a trance, in a state that allows them to experience one type of material world versus one type of spiritual. So being in between both worlds at any given time, it's really hard for people who are on a scientific path to understand, other than perhaps through a meditative state or a hypnotic state. While when you do with people who deal with something that's spiritual, they tend to understand that they're seeing more than just what the material world has to offer. So once again, it's a matter of vernacular and perspective.
If people are really interested in pursuing that kind of knowledge, what do you recommend?
As what? Being a trans medium or dealing with hypnosis and that kind of thing?
Well, yeah. Well, I guess a trans medium, really. If someone's really interested in exploring those possibilities and so forth, what do you recommend?
About 5 years of research, and then finding a practitioner who's actually, has a reputation for these things and the ability to do, what they claim to do. There's a lot of people out there that are like, oh, I can see ghosts. Your uncle died 25 minutes ago. Do you know that? That's not the kind of person you want to deal with. You want to deal with someone who has been doing this for a while, who can recommend a regimen of research for you to follow, because it's not something that you can do overnight. It's something that if you're going to do it correctly, and if you have the natural ability to do so, it's going to take a lot of work. So if you're not able to do all that work and take your time to, dedicate it to what you want to do effectively, then there's no point in doing it.
I agree, and I know we're coming to the end of the program, and I know you've got other things that you have to move on to, but Ryan, we sure appreciate you coming on tonight, and I look forward to having you back again.
Yeah, and I appreciate your insight because, a lot of what you were talking about with the difference between exorcisms and vanishings and stuff, I never knew that, so.
Sure, anytime. If you guys need me at all, you can get a hold of me. If not, I'm always here. And if anyone has any questions, they can get a hold of me via my website, which is the Third Eye Chronicles. I'm always available for information, for questions, answers, comments, concerns, investigations, that kind of thing.
Yeah. By the way, also, real quick add to, while we were on this conversation here at our location, we heard the cart moving across the floor. We got footsteps run up on us. We've had all kinds of interesting sounds and phenomena happening over here behind us.
Yeah, they were experiencing all that while I was talking. So.
Yeah, they wanted to be part of the show.
That's right. So. That's right. And we will definitely be getting talking soon, Ryan. And you guys have a good night, and we sure appreciate it.
Thanks.
Okay.
You too. Thanks again. I love being on the show, so anytime you need anything, I'm always here.
Okay. Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
You too.